Hello and welcome back to Bitchy History, the show where we dig through the archives, ruin everyone's favorite comforting myths, and occasionally find a woman in a sensible suit standing in front of a cage insisting that the lock is actually a perk. Today, unfortunately, we are talking about Phyllis Schlafly. And we're not starting in the 1970s, not in the Equal Rights Amendment fight, not in a state legislature full of men suddenly very concerned about the delicate constitutional condition of American womanhood. We're starting in 2026. Because apparently the Schlafly family business is still selling the same product, dependents with a warranty and a Fox News login.
Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Bitchy?
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
Great, keep that bitchy energy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
In May of 2026, Fox News published an opinion piece by Ann Schlafly, Phyllis Schlafly's daughter, titled, "Phyllis Schlafly was right. America must put babies and mothers first." The subtitle was, "No job is more vital than motherhood." The piece opens by quoting Phyllis. "Feminism has changed the way that women think, and it has changed the way men think, and the trouble is it hasn't changed the attitude of babies at all." And there it is, the entire argument, embalmed and wheeled back out under fluorescent opinion page lighting. Ann Schlafly argues that institutional daycare cannot provide what mothers provide, that children need parents rather than a nanny state, and that subsidized daycare can undermine the family by diminishing the provider's role in the home. The child, she says, wants mother care, not daycare. Stay-at-home mothers lose under taxpayer-paid childcare because they don't receive a subsidy for remaining at home. Daycare workers lose, taxpayers lose, bureaucrats win, politicians win, and at the center of it all sits the same old assumption. The proper family is built around mother care, father provision, private dependence, and a deep suspicion of any policy that gives women more room to maneuver. So yes, Phyllis Schlafly is dead. Thank God. But her agenda is still very much alive and kicking. And that's what this episode is really about. Not simply Phyllis Schlafly as a person, although don't worry, we will be roasting her. This episode is about the afterlife of her arguments, that women's dependence is protection, that public support is government tyranny, that male provision is the family's load-bearing wall, and that feminism's greatest crime was giving women the audacity to ask whether that wall was actually a cage. Let's be extremely clear from the beginning, because this is where bad faith people like to start flinging casserole dishes. This is not an episode attacking motherhood. This is not an episode attacking homemakers. This is not an episode attacking religious women, women who love their families, women who stay home with children, or women who genuinely want a domestic life. Homemaking is labor. Motherhood is labor. Care work is labor. People who raise children are doing work so essential that society collapses without it, which is exactly why society has historically worked so hard to make sure women do all of that labor for free. This episode is about a scam, a very successful scam, a scam wrapped in family values, powdered with nostalgia, defended with Bible verses, and served in a casserole dish labeled privilege. Phyllis Schlafly's great political trick was not simply that she opposed feminism or helped defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. Lots of people opposed the ERA. Some opposed it for legal reasons, some for political reasons, and some because any sentence containing the word equality apparently causes hives in certain corners of American life. Schlafly's genius, and I do mean genius in the same way that one might describe a very efficient plague rat, was that she convinced enough Americans that women's legal, economic, and social dependence was not dependence at all. It was privilege. It was protection. It was dignity. It was the sacred arrangement of civilization itself. Phyllis looked at a system where women's survival was often routed through husbands, where motherhood came with economic punishment, where wives could be legally and culturally trapped, where childcare was treated as women's private obligation, and where public support for women's independence was framed as government tyranny, and she said, "Ladies, don't throw away this excellent benefits package." Which brings us to the question at the center of this episode. What kind of privilege disappears when women become equal? Because that was Schlafly's argument against the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA was not long. It wasn't a 1,000-page bureaucratic horror novel. It was not a feminist IKEA manual for dismantling the American family with an Allen wrench and a suspiciously calm set of diagrams. The text was very simple. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. That is the allegedly civilization-ending language. No mention of mandatory combat boots, no clause requiring all women to abandon their children to a government warehouse, no secret footnote saying that Betty Friedan personally gets custody of your husband. Just equality under law. But Schlafly turned that sentence into a haunted house. Inside that haunted house were all the old familiar monsters. Your daughter drafted into the military, your husband no longer required to support you, your children split like a restaurant check, your bathroom invaded, your family destroyed, your church humiliated, and civilization itself lying face down in the shag carpet. That was the machine. Equality becomes sameness. Sameness becomes danger. Danger requires protection. Protection requires hierarchy. Hierarchy gets renamed as love, and that's how you call the walk privilege. To understand how she did this, we need to walk through the bookshelf from hell. Our source pile today includes books such as The Power of the Christian Woman, Feminist Fantasies, Who Will Rock the Cradle, Who Killed the American Family, and The Flip Side of Feminism, What Conservative Women Know and Men Can't Say. Together, these books form a complete ecosystem. A swamp ecosystem complete with alligators, but an ecosystem nonetheless. The Power of the Christian Woman gives us the theology. Feminist Fantasies gives us the anti-feminist demonology. Who Will Rock the Cradle gives us the childcare panic. Who Killed the American Family gives us murder board nostalgia. And The Flip Side of Feminism gives us the conservative women as patriarchy's ventriloquist dummy update. But before we get to the books, we need to talk about Schlafly herself, because her life is one of the great ironies of modern American conservatism. Phyllis Schlafly made a career out of arguing that careers were making women miserable. The irony did not merely enter the room, it bought property, refinanced, and started a newsletter. Schlafly was not some passive homemaker who accidentally wandered into politics after confusing a state house for a PTA meeting. She was highly educated, disciplined, ambitious. She was a deeply public political actor. Her own author biography in Feminist Fantasies describes her as the author or editor of 20 books, holder of a Harvard master's degree and a law degree, a syndicated columnist, publisher of the Phyllis Schlafly Report since 1967, a speaker or debater on more than 500 college campuses, a witness before more than 50 congressional and state legislative committees, and a regular presence on national television. That is not just a homemaker. That is an institution with enough hairspray to be responsible for her own hole in the ozone layer. Conservatives knew it, too. Ann Coulter's foreword to Feminist Fantasies basically canonizes her, calling Schlafly one of the most important people of the 20th century and declaring only half-jokingly that she has always been right and she will always be right. Coulter also celebrates Schlafly as someone who was, at the same time, writing her syndicated column, raising 6 highly accomplished children, and defeating the ERA. Which is fascinating, because Schlafly herself became living proof that women could organize, write, debate, travel, lobby, testify, publish, and reshape national politics while being a mother. She was not powerless, she was not voiceless, she was not confined to the private domestic sphere. She was publicly powerful, and she used that power to tell other women that feminism was making them unhappy and equality would ruin them. This matters because Schlafly's politics depended on a very careful distinction. Conservative women could be strong, ambitious, articulate, and influential as long as they used that influence to defend traditional hierarchy. A woman could speak in public as long as she spoke for patriarchy. A woman could wield power as long as she insisted women did not need power as a class. A woman could live as an exception and sell submission as a rule. That's exactly what Schlafly did. Her worldview is laid out most clearly in The Power of the Christian Woman, a book whose title promises power, but whose contents mostly explain how women can feel powerful while accepting a legally vulnerable position with excellent posture. Schlafly's foundation is complementarity. Men and women are different, not just different in some ways, different in ways that organize family, society, law, politics, and destiny. She writes that woman was not made identical to man, and that woman was not designed to be his competitor, and that men and women were made to complement each other. She also argues that to deny women's sexual differences is to deny the very essence of womanhood. At first, this may sound like a familiar conservative religious argument, men and women are different but equally valuable. But watch the trapdoor open. Difference becomes destiny. Destiny becomes law. Law becomes a barricade around women's autonomy. This is complementarity as legal origami. Fold womanhood enough times and somehow it becomes obedience. The issue is not whether human bodies differ. Historians are not standing here confused by the existence of pregnancy, lactation, chromosomes, hormones, or the tragic fact that men can eat one vegetable and expect applause. The issue is what Schlafly does with difference. In her world, difference is not a simple fact. It is a command. Women are different, therefore women belong in different roles. Women are mothers, therefore motherhood is their natural fulfillment. Women are wives, therefore marriage must preserve male provision. Women are physically different, therefore sex-neutral law is dangerous. Women are vulnerable to war, divorce, sexuality, work, and modernity, therefore patriarchy becomes protection. This is where Schlafly fits into a much longer history of what we might call flattering containment. Women have often been revered and demeaned at the same time. They're put on pedestals, called morally superior, told they're delicate, nurturing, spiritually refined, naturally self-sacrificing, and uniquely suited to care. That can sound like praise, but it is praise with a leash attached. It's the old benevolent sexism problem. Women are treasured precisely so they can be limited. American history is littered with this argument. 19th century separate spheres ideology told women that they were morally superior but belonged in the home. Anti-suffrage activists argued that women didn't need the vote because they already had influence as wives and mothers. Southern paternalism argued that white women had the right to protection, which also meant the obligation to obey. Post-war domestic ideology told women that true fulfillment came through marriage, childhood, and housewifery. And when women were unhappy with that arrangement, the culture often diagnosed the woman rather than the arrangement. Schlafly didn't invent this tradition, she just modernized it. She took the old argument that women are special and used it against constitutional equality. Nowhere does this become clearer than in her attack on the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA emerged from a much longer history of women's rights activism. Alice Paul first introduced the idea in the 1920s after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The basic idea was simple. If women were citizens, then equality on the basis of sex should be constitutionally protected. By the 1960s and 1970s, second-wave feminism, civil rights activism, workplace discrimination cases, reproductive rights battles, Title IX, welfare rights organizing, and women's growing political activism all helped revive the ERA as part of a broader push to outlaw sex discrimination in the United States. The amendment passed Congress in 1972 with overwhelming bipartisan support and went to the states for ratification. Within the first year, 30 states had ratified it. It looked for a brief moment like the ERA might become part of the Constitution. Then Schlafly entered the chat. In The Power of the Christian Woman, she warns that the women who think the ERA simply means equal pay for equal work are in for a big shock. In The Flip Side of Feminism, Schlafly and Suzanne Venker admit that the Equal Rights Amendment sounded so benign that who could possibly oppose it, and then describe their organization, Stop ERA, as a little band of women in red working from Schlafly's kitchen without internet, email, fax machines, Rush Limbaugh, or Fox News. They frame Schlafly's movement as a kind of conservative David against feminist Goliath, one Midwestern mother against presidents, Hollywood, feminists, universities, newspapers, Congress, and the entire modern world. And politically, that story worked, unfortunately, because Schlafly was not only arguing law, she was staging emotional theater. Draft panic, custody panic, husband support panic, bathroom panic, abortion panic, gay rights panic, federal courts panic, women will become men panic. Sounds familiar. The ERA was one sentence. Schlafly treated it like it came with a satanic army. But of all the arguments Schlafly made against the ERA, the most revealing was her claim that women would lose their existing rights and privileges. That's the heart of the scam. Schlafly argued that the ERA would destroy sex-specific legal protections for women. In The Power of the Christian Woman, she points to sex-neutral support language such as each spouse has the duty to support the other spouse, and describes this as a tremendous reduction of wives' previous legal rights. Elsewhere, she claims that the ERA would wipe out what she calls the most basic and precious legal right wives enjoyed, the right to be a full-time homemaker. And here's where we need to be very precise. Schlafly was not entirely inventing the existence of sex-specific legal structures. Those structures existed. Laws did often assume husbands were providers and wives were dependents. The legal system did contain protections for wives, widows, mothers, and homemakers based on women's dependent position within a marriage. But Schlafly interpreted those structures upside down. In a world where women were paid less, pushed out of economic power, punished for motherhood, denied full access to professions, And culturally pressured into marriage, husbandly support could matter. Of course it could. No serious feminist argument says abandoned wives and children should be left to starve in the name of abstract legal tidiness. That was never the question. The question was, why was a woman's survival routed through men in the first place? Schlafly's answer was to preserve the dependency and call it a privilege. She looked at women being structurally pushed into reliance on husbands and said, "Ladies, don't throw away this excellent hostage arrangement." Calling dependency a privilege is like calling a leash jewelry just because someone polished the clasp. A wife's right to support sounds good when the alternative is poverty. But if that right depends on women remaining economically secondary, legally distinct, and socially dependent, then it's not liberation. It's compensation for subordination. It's a coupon for the system that trapped you. Schlafly's politics didn't ask why women needed male provision to survive. They asked how to keep male provision central enough that women would fear equality. That's why rights and privileges is such an important phrase. It made the cage sound like safety instead of prison. She did the same thing with custody rights. In one interview, Schlafly argued that under the existing system, mothers usually got children after divorce, and then asked who would trade that for the so-called equality, where, as she put it, each parent gets one child. Now, no, the ERA did not say judges must divide children like Halloween candy or the plot of The Parent Trap, but Schlafly was not aiming for careful constitutional interpretation. She was creating a maternal panic drama. She made equality sound grotesque, mechanical, and anti-mother. She repeated this idea in The Power of the Christian Woman, warning that the ERA could lead courts to divide children between parents or award custody to fathers in roughly half of cases. The deeper issue is that maternal preference in custody was not feminist liberation. It came from the same gender ideology that treated childbearing as woman's natural duty. Patriarchy said mothers belonged with children, which could benefit mothers in custody disputes. But it also said childcare was a woman's unpaid obligation, woman's natural work, woman's moral burden, and woman's failure if anything went wrong. Schlafly wanted the privilege attached to maternal duty without interrogating the duty itself. Patriarchy always invoices the gift. Then, of course, there was the draft. Schlafly loved the draft argument because it was emotionally explosive. In interviews, she argued that women didn't want to be treated just like men, and asked whether women had rushed to draft boards during Vietnam demanding equal treatment. In The Flip Side of Feminism, Schlafly and Venker say that the military draft became a major argument because the country was just coming out of Vietnam. In Who Killed the American Family, Schlafly says Stop ERA exposed the amendment as threatening the rights of an 18-year-old girl not to be drafted and sent into combat. This was one of her most effective tricks. Equality became being treated just like men. Being treated just like men became being fed into a war machine. And I want to be clear, a feminist response does not have to be, wonderful, draft women immediately. Personally, if your vision of equality begins with a draft board, I have several follow-up questions and none of them are polite. The feminist response can be, why is militarized citizenship the model in the first place? Feminists then and now said, actually, the draft is bad. Maybe we just don't have it for anyone. Women have always been affected by war. They have served, nursed, labored, resisted, spied, organized, mourned, starved, been displaced, been sexually assaulted, been widowed, and been used as symbols of national honor and violation. War has never politely avoided women. It simply avoided giving them equal rank, equal authority, equal recognition, equal pay, and equal control over the decision that send nations to war. Schlafly didn't have any intention of dismantling the war machine. She just put a ladies exempt sticker on it and called that liberation. The draft argument allowed her to say, look, women are protected by sex inequality. But again, that protection depends on exclusion. Women are excluded from one burden of citizenship and then told that exclusion proves that they don't need full constitutional equality. That's a neat trick if no one looks too closely. Unfortunately for Schlafly, looking too closely is why historians have coffee. The aftermath of looking too closely is why we have gin. She used the same move on equal pay, of course. In a 1980 debate, Schlafly argued that the ERA had nothing to do with equal pay because existing laws already covered employment discrimination. She pointed to the Equal Pay Act, Equal Employment Law, the EEOC, and affirmative action enforcement. Her opponent, Peg Anderson, responded with the key point. The ERA would reinforce the principle behind those laws and give permanence to equality guarantees. This is important because Schlafly's argument was basically, why do women need constitutional equality when they already have statutes? But statutes can be narrowed, statutes can be underfunded, statutes can be repealed, they can be reinterpreted into a sad little puddle that accomplishes nothing. Constitutional principles matter because they're harder to treat as optional. Schlafly's argument is like telling someone they don't need to reinforce the foundation because the wallpaper looks amazing. And this is why the ERA mattered beyond any one single legal question. It was about whether equality on the basis of sex would be treated as a foundational constitutional principle or as a patchwork of laws women should be grateful to have until someone decided otherwise. Schlafly said women already had enough. Feminists said enough is not the same as equal. But Schlafly's anti-feminism didn't stop with the ERA. Across her books, she built an entire architecture of backlash, and one of its load-bearing walls was childcare. Remember Anne Schlafly's 2026 Fox piece that we started with? Children need mother care, not daycare. Institutional daycare can't provide the same nurturing environment as mothers. Government support leads mothers away from fathers. Subsidized daycare diminishes the provider's role in the home. That's not new. That is a vintage Schlafly original. In Who Will Rock the Cradle, Schlafly frames the childcare debate by asking whether we're talking about childcare, meaning the care of children, or support for daycare, or federal financing and regulation of institutional daycare. Then she makes the pivot. The question is not, is woman's place in the home, but is the child's place in the home? That's rhetorically clever, I guess. She moves the debate away from women's autonomy and towards child protection. Then she lands the ultimate question: who will control the raising of our children, the government or the family? In Schlafly's world, public childcare was never just childcare. It was government takeover. It's the village coming for your baby. It's feminism outsourcing motherhood. It's the state replacing the family. It's Marxism with tiny chairs. And again, watch the trick. Public support is tyranny. Private dependence is freedom. Helping parents afford care is government seizure, but making women dependent on marriage is freedom because the cage has gingham curtains. In Who Killed the American Family, Schlafly places daycare among the long feminist assaults on the family, writing that feminist demands for federally financed daycare appeared repeatedly over the decades. She also identifies taxpayer-paid daycare as one of the hot-button issues at the 1977 International Women's Year Conference, alongside the ERA, abortion, and gay rights. And in The Flip Side of Feminism, Schlafly and Vinker argue that women on the left pursue abortion and daycare because babies are an obstacle to equality. There it is again. Women's autonomy becomes anti-child. Public support becomes anti-family. Anything that makes women less dependent on husbands becomes a threat to civilization. Schlafly's politics require motherhood to be privatized, feminized, and morally compulsory, not because she hates mothers, that would be too simple, but because her entire political worldview depends on the family absorbing care work privately, with women doing the labor and men occupying the role of provider/protector. If the state helps with childcare, women have more options. If women have more options, marriage becomes less economically compulsory. If marriage becomes less economically compulsory, male provision loses some of its political power. And if that happens, then the whole protection bargain starts looking less like sacred order and more like a rigged contract. Schlafly knew that. Which brings us to the book Feminist Fantasies, which is basically Schlafly's anti-feminist greatest hits album, except all the songs are about how women are unhappy because they stopped listening to Phyllis. In that book, Schlafly argues that feminism has nothing to do with being feminine, which I guess she's right about. The two words have nothing to do with each other. She contrasts feminists with what she calls the professional homemaker, whom she describes as a happy woman. The 1950s homemakers drugged to the gills with tranquilizers might have something to say about that, but Phyllis wasn't asking. This is a repeated Schlafly move. Feminists are not merely wrong, they are miserable. They're bitter, they're lonely, they're anti-male, they're anti-child, they're spiritually disordered, they are jealous of happy wives and mothers. They're apparently one consciousness-raising session away from setting fire to a bassinet. The genre requires feminists to be miserable because otherwise the whole argument collapses. If women can pursue equality and still love, marry, mother, worship, work, build communities, and live meaningful lives, then Schlafly's either-or world falls apart, so feminism has to become a pathology. This didn't come out of nowhere either. After World War II, American culture saw a targeted push to send women back to domesticity after wartime labor had expanded women's public roles. Works like The Modern Woman, The Lost Sex helped give scientific-ish respectability to the idea that modern women were psychologically disordered, that feminism was a deep illness, and that women's true stability depended on restoring domestic roles. It was patriarchy in a lab coat, tapping its clipboard and diagnosing women with "please go home." Schlafly's anti-feminism belongs to that tradition. She writes about feminists the way medieval monks wrote about demons, with absolute confidence, limited fieldwork, and a lot of anxiety about women doing things unsupervised. This argument becomes even more dramatic in the book Who Killed the American Family, which is late-career Schlafly in full murder board mode. The title asks, "Who killed the American family?" Spoiler, the answer is everyone Schlafly already hated. In the introduction, she says the book explains the forces that abolished the American family as we knew it in the 1950s, including changes in law, court decisions, culture, education, and the intelligentsia. She writes that gays and lesbians get much of the publicity for attacks on marriage, but are vastly outnumbered by feminists, judges, and experts. This book is basically Murder on the Orient Express if every subject were feminism and the victim were a sitcom. Schlafly opens the nostalgia portal immediately. "When I was married in 1949, she writes, "it was perfectly normal to quit my job." Normal is doing a lot of work there. She describes a white picket fence, full-time homemaker, 6-child domestic world as the norm. Then she states the underlying structure plainly. The old family model was based on defined gender roles: breadwinner and protector husband, full-time homemaker mother, and children responsible to their father and mother. And this is crucial. She calls the nuclear family the best gateway to major conservative goals, including individual liberty, limited government, less government spending, and restraints on government meddling. That's the quiet part, printed neatly out loud. For Schlafly, the family is not just a private moral unit, it's a conservative political infrastructure. The breadwinner homemaker family privatizes care, it reduces reliance on public systems, it preserves parental authority, it channels women's labor into the home, and it ties women's economic security to marriage. It turns the family into a buffer against the state. That's why feminism is such a threat to her worldview. It doesn't merely change women's lives, it changes the political economy of conservatism. If women can earn, leave, delay marriage, avoid pregnancy, access contraception and abortion, use childcare, pursue education, own property, control sexuality, divorce abusive or miserable husbands, and expect legal equality, then the family can't function as the same private containment system she wants it to. Schlafly sees that not as transformation, democratization, or the messy expansion of human freedom. She sees it as the death of her worldview. By 2014, Schlafly had turned feminist ruined everything into a full home security system for the conservative imagination. That's when we get the flip side of feminism, which is Schlafly and Suzanne Venker translating the old anti-feminism into 21st century conservative women's advice manuals. The book begins by saying it is about the effect left-wing women have had on American society and claims that feminist dogma now governs the dialogue and narrative in almost every sector of American life. It rejects terms like new feminism or pro-life feminism with a line as if there were such a thing. One of its epigraphs from Margaret Thatcher says, "I owe nothing to women's lib." Later, the book declares that feminism is not about equal rights, but about power for the female left. This matters because the flip side of feminism shows Schlafly's afterlife as a template. Feminism becomes brainwashing. Women's studies becomes indoctrination. Left-wing women become cultural puppet masters. Conservative women become truth tellers. Men get to say, "A woman said it, not me." This is one of the most important pieces of Schlafly's legacy. She helped build the model of the anti-feminist woman as a validator. A woman can absolutely be an agent of patriarchy. This doesn't mean she lacks agency. It means agency is not automatically liberatory. Women can exercise agency in the service of backlash. Women can enforce systems that harm other women. Women can benefit from hierarchy and then describe that hierarchy as natural. Women can use public power to tell other women that public power is spiritually dangerous, socially destructive, and politically unnecessary. This isn't complicated unless your politics require women to be magically incapable of enforcing systems that harm women, and Schlafly was very good at that. She gave conservatism a woman's voice for patriarchy. She made anti-feminism look maternal. She made backlash sound like common sense. She made women's rights sound like a trick. She made dependence sound prudent. She made hierarchy sound loving. And her rhetoric didn't die with her. That's why that Fox News piece matters. Anne Schlafly's 2026 argument repeats the same architecture. Babies need mothers, not institutional daycare. The nanny state is a threat. Government welfare leads women away from fathers. Subsidized daycare undermines the provider role. Stay-at-home mothers lose because they don't receive subsidies for remaining home. That is pure Schlafly. It's not really about honoring mothers. Honoring mothers would mean paid leave, healthcare, childcare options, housing, reproductive freedom, protection from violence, protection from poverty, and policies that make parenting less punishing. This is about making motherhood private, unpaid, morally compulsory, and dependent on the male provider model. It's about keeping care work inside the family, keeping women's choices constrained by economics, and calling that arrangement natural. You hear Schlafly's logic every time someone says that women don't need rights because men are supposed to protect them. You hear it in tradwife content that confuses dependence with freedom because the kitchen has nice lighting. You hear it in anti-childcare politics that treat public support as family destruction. You hear it in anti-abortion rhetoric that turns motherhood into destiny and then calls forced pregnancy a gift. You hear it in attacks on no-fault divorce where leaving becomes selfishness and endurance becomes virtue. You hear it in anti-trans bathroom panic, which uses women's safety as a weapon against other people's rights while doing almost nothing about the actual structures that endanger women. You hear it in every claim that feminism made women unhappy because now they have too many choices. Schlafly's books are useful because they show us the architecture of backlash before it learned to use TikTok. The structure is always the same. Equality becomes sameness, sameness becomes danger, danger requires protection, protection requires hierarchy, hierarchy becomes love. By the time the argument reaches the public, the lock has been polished, the cage has curtains, and someone is standing there telling women they should be grateful for the upholstery. So let's be very clear about what makes this whole thing so revealing. If Schlafly's vision of womanhood was so natural, so fulfilling, so obviously superior, why did it need this much enforcement? Why did it need legal hierarchy? Why did it need economic dependence? Why did it need panic campaigns against daycare, divorce, equal rights, gay people, bathrooms, abortion, and women in public life? Why did it need books, speeches, lobbying groups, church networks, newsletters, court battles, state legislatures, and an entire conservative media ecosystem standing guard around the kitchen door? That's always the part that gives the game away. Schlafly and women like her insist that motherhood, domesticity, and dependence on male provision are women's natural destiny. But if that were true in the way they claim, they wouldn't need to keep building fences around every other option. Feminists are not, generally speaking, trying to ban women from being mothers. Feminists are not trying to outlaw homemaking. Feminists are not trying to drag happy stay-at-home wives into the street and force them into blazers at clipboard point. And yes, I know that every movement does have fringe extremes because human beings can ruin absolutely anything, including brunch and political theory. But the broad feminist project has never been that women must reject motherhood, family, marriage, religion, or domestic life in order to be free. The point is that those roles should not be compulsory or enforced by society. That's the distinction that Schlafly's entire political ideology worked so hard to blur. A woman choosing to stay home is not the problem. A political movement trying to make staying home the only respectable, affordable, moral, socially protected option is the problem. A woman loving motherhood is not the problem. A political system using motherhood to deny women bodily autonomy, economic independence, public authority, and legal equality is the problem. A woman building a traditional marriage because she genuinely wants one is not the problem. A movement that treats women's dependence on husbands as the foundation of civilization is. And that is why Schlafly's version of choice was always so hollow. She claimed to defend women who valued home and family, but she didn't simply defend their right to choose that life. She fought against policies and legal structures that would make other choices survivable. That's not defending choice. That's defending a funnel. Because real choices require options. It requires the ability to leave. It requires wages, childcare, housing, education, healthcare, reproductive freedom, protection from violence, and legal equality. It requires a world where marriage is not a woman's emergency shelter, motherhood is not a punishment, and dependence is not rebranded as virtue because the alternative has been made deliberately terrifying. Schlafly did not defend homemakers by insisting women did not need equality. Homemakers don't need women's constitutional inequality for their work to matter. She didn't defend motherhood by attacking childcare. Motherhood doesn't become more sacred because mothers have fewer options. She didn't defend family by opposing feminism. Family doesn't require women's legal subordination unless the family being defended is less of a relationship than a chain of command. That's what makes the modern revival of this argument so fucking exhausting. Every generation, someone shows up to sell women the same old bargain. Give up autonomy and receive protection. Give up equality and receive praise. Give up public power and receive moral authority. Give up options and receive approval. And every time they call it natural. But if it has to be enforced this hard, it's not natural. It's political. Phyllis Schlafly called the lock privilege. She called the cage protection. She called dependency dignity. And because she said it as a woman, a mother, a lawyer, a conservative organizer, the movement could pretend patriarchy had been democratically endorsed by its prisoners. And Schlafly is still polishing the lock. Fox News is still handing over the rag and the silver polish, and the sales pitch is still the same. Dependency as dignity, hierarchy as protection, and women's constrained choices sold back to them as freedom. But rights are not punishment for the content. Equality is not an attack on mothers. Childcare is not an attack on families. Divorce is not an attack on marriage. Reproductive freedom is not an attack on babies. And feminism is not the reason some women don't choose domesticity. Feminism is the one reason they have any meaningful choice at all. Protection that requires subordination is not protection. It's a cage with curtains. And I, for one, am fucking sick of being asked to admire the upholstery. Thank you for listening. This has been Bitchy History.
History. History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?